The chamber fell into a silence, so sharp it seemed to slice through the air. All eyes locked on J.D. Vance as he fumbled for words, his lips parting but no sound emerging. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett stood steady, her gaze unwavering, her question hanging in the air like a thunderclap. "Answer the people," she had demanded, her tone calm yet cutting. The weight of her words settled heavy on the room, and in that instant, the roles reversed, power shifted. Vance had walked in with the swagger of certainty, a man convinced he could dominate the conversation, dismiss his challenger, and dictate the tone. But Crockett's timing was perfect. She struck not with anger, but with precision, cutting directly into the contradictions he'd hoped would go unnoticed. And when she did, the silence that followed spoke louder than any of his carefully rehearsed lines ever could. It wasn't just silence, it was exposure. Cameras zoomed in on his frozen expression, journalists scribbled furiously, and even allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was a kind of pause that became unforgettable, the kind replayed on news loops, dissected on talk shows, and shared across millions of screens. For Crockett, it wasn't merely a moment of winning an argument. It was about reclaiming dignity in a space too often filled with arrogance. Her calm presence stood in contrast to his unraveling, her strength magnified by his weakness. To those watching, immigrants, workers, students, families, her stance wasn't just about politics. It was about them. She wasn't silencing a senator. She was giving voice to the silenced. And that silence, stretched second by second, turned from awkward to powerful. It was no longer the absence of sound. It became the sound of truth pressing down on someone who had none. Crockett's restraint, her refusal to break the tension with anything less than dignity, left the audience breathless. What began as a routine exchange spiraled into a moment that defined the stakes of the debate. The clash wasn't about words anymore. It was about composure, about who carried the truth with them and who crumbled without it. But this was only the beginning, because as the chamber shifted uneasily and the silence lingered, the world outside was waiting to see what would come next, and the answer would ignite far more than a single room. To understand the weight of that silence, you have to step back and see what was on the line before Crockett and Vance ever exchanged a word. This wasn't just another clash inside the chamber. It was a battle over credibility, over who truly spoke for America's dignity and who merely performed for power. J.D. Vance walked into the room with a reputation to uphold. He had styled himself as a champion for forgotten, but too often his words revealed something else, a taste for spectacle, a reliance on bluster. His confidence was his armor, and his silence-proof shield was supposed to be his sharp rhetoric. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. He had stumbled before, but never under lights this bright, never in front of an opponent who refused to flinch. Crockett came in carrying more than her own voice. She carried the voices of those overlooked, immigrants who had fought for a place in America, families tired of being dismissed, workers silenced in political debates that rarely acknowledged their struggles. Every word she spoke wasn't for applause. It was for validation. Her calm was her strategy, and her strength was her refusal to mirror arrogance with arrogance. The room itself seemed to understand the stakes. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras rolled without blinking, and even colleagues who often ignored these exchanges couldn't look away. The atmosphere thickened with every pause, every stare, every unspoken word. The silence after her question wasn't just awkward, it was damning. It became the kind of moment that defined not only two people, but two competing visions of leadership. For Crockett, exposing contradiction wasn't just about cornering Vance. It was about showing the public that arrogance collapses under scrutiny. For Vance, every second of hesitation chipped away at his carefully built persona. This was more than a debate. It was reputation on trial. And the jury wasn't just in that chamber. It was millions watching, waiting to decide who they believed in more. But the silence was only the spark. The real explosion was still ahead, because what unfolded after this pause would reveal not just who held their ground, but who held the truth. And the stakes were about to rise higher than anyone in that room could have imagined. To grasp why J.D. Vance's silence hit so hard, you have to see the man behind the mask. He wasn't always a senator commanding headlines. He was once a storyteller, selling the image of a small-town kid who rose against the odds. His memoir had made him a media darling, a supposed truth-teller about working-class struggles. But somewhere along the way, the authenticity hardened into performance. The underdog became the politician, and the fighter for the voiceless became the defender of power. By the time he stepped into that chamber, Vance had built a brand on confidence. He spoke in sweeping declarations, often dismissing opponents with a smirk or a sharp retort. He leaned into a kind of practiced bravado, an armor meant to shield him from accountability. To his base, this made him strong. To others, it made him hollow. His pattern was clear. Project certainty, overwhelmed with confidence, and never, ever pause. Pausing meant doubt. Pausing meant weakness. Which is exactly why Crockett's well-aimed question cut deeper than most realized. For the first time, his shield wasn't enough. For the first time, his silence betrayed him. That moment of hesitation didn't emerge out of nowhere. It was born of contradictions. Vance had built himself as a champion of ordinary people. Yet too often his actions and alliances betrayed those very promises. Crockett's question illuminated that fracture, pulling back the curtain on the gap between words and deeds. And the irony? His greatest strength, his voice, his confidence, became his downfall when he lost it. In a chamber where every second of silence is magnified, those empty beats told the story better than any opponent could. The man who had made a career of controlling the narrative suddenly had no narrative left. What the public saw in that silence wasn't just a senator caught off guard. It was a mask slipping, a persona cracking. And if Crockett was steady as stone, Vance was suddenly fragile glass. The question wasn't just whether he could recover. It was whether he ever truly believed the image he had crafted. And as the silence stretched, one truth became undeniable. The cracks were widening. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that chamber by accident. Her presence was a product of grit, sacrifice, and a deep conviction that politics should serve people, not egos. Long before she faced J.D. Vance across that floor, she had faced battles that tested her resilience far more than any debate ever could. Her story was one of climbing uphill, refusing to let barriers define her. Where others saw ceilings, she saw opportunities to push harder. She came from communities often ignored by power, communities where justice wasn't a guarantee but a fight. That fight shaped her voice, sharpening it into a tool not of anger, but of clarity. By the time she entered politics, she was no stranger to being underestimated, and no stranger to proving people wrong. What set her apart wasn't just her command of facts or her ability to land sharp questions. It was her sense of purpose. She wasn't there to score points. She was there to make space for those whose stories were rarely heard in chambers of power. For immigrants chasing the American promise. For families working paycheck to paycheck. For students carrying hope heavier than their resources. Crockett carried their voices into every exchange. And unlike Vance's carefully polished bravado, Crockett's strength was rooted in authenticity. She didn't need to posture. Her very presence was proof of persistence. Her calm in the face of arrogance came from experience. Years of standing tall when others tried to silence her. So when she squared off against Vance, it wasn't just another debate. It was the latest chapter in a life defined by resilience. Every word she spoke carried the weight of those who believed in her, and every silence she held was a lesson she had already lived. That dignity can be louder than noise. The clash was never just about two lawmakers. It was about two different Americas, one built on arrogance, the other on struggle and truth. And as Crockett stood unshaken, the contrast could not have been sharper. But her backstory explained her strength. It also set the stage for what came next. Because this wasn't only about who they were. It was about how they would collide when the debate turned explosive. The silence should have ended the exchange. It should have broken J.D. Vance's stride long enough for him to retreat, recalibrate, and move on. But silence is a cruel teacher. It lingers, it magnifies, it demands attention. What happened next was not retreat, but escalation. Vance tried to claw his way back, and Jasmine Crockett was ready. He cleared his throat, adjusted his notes, and forced a smirk that looked more like armor than confidence. "Representative Crockett," he began, voice slow and deliberate, "you're oversimplifying matters you don't fully understand." It was meant to sound authoritative, dismissive even, as if the silence had been nothing more than a pause for effect. But the words rang hollow. The chamber heard his stumble, felt his unease. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't even break eye contact. "Senator," she replied evenly, "what I understand is that the people you claim to represent deserve clarity, not excuses." Her tone didn't rise, but the precision cut through his attempted recovery. Each phrase landed like a weight, steady and deliberate. The back and forth quickened. Vance leaned on volume, hoping projection would restore control. Crockett leaned on calm, allowing contrast to do the work. He interrupted, pointed fingers, threw out broad claims as though sheer quantity could disguise cracks in his reasoning. She listened, nodded occasionally, and dismantled his points with surgical control. The spectators felt the shift. This was no longer about statistics or talking points. It was about posture. Vance's voice grew louder, but his desperation bled through. Crockett's restraint made his bluster look frantic, and desperation, under the public eye, never plays well. At one point, Vance pivoted toward familiar ground, invoking populist lines about forgotten workers and sweeping claims about defending tradition. But Crockett was prepared. "If workers were truly your concern," she countered, "you wouldn't silence them when they demand fair pay. And if tradition guided you, you'd remember America's strongest tradition is dignity." The word struck harder than volume ever could. The room tightened with tension. Each exchange carried weight beyond the chamber. To Crockett's supporters, she was voicing truths long buried. To Vance's, she was exposing fragility in his bravado. The debate was no longer about policy. It had become a contest of character, who stayed steady under fire and who cracked when faced with inconvenient truths. Then came the breaking point. Frustration etched across his face. Vance slammed his hand lightly against the desk. "This isn't a courtroom," he snapped. "And you're not the judge here." His voice cracked just enough to betray the pressure. The chamber stiffened. The optics were unmistakable. A man known for control was losing it. Live, in front of the cameras. Crockett let his words hang in the air, then answered with a calm finality sharper than any raised voice. "No, Senator. This is not a courtroom. This is America's chamber, and the people are the judge." Her tone was steady, her composure unbreakable. The contrast was cinematic. Calm against chaos, dignity against offensiveness. The escalation reached its peak. Crockett hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed theatrics. By standing unshaken, she exposed every crack in his performance. Each of his attempts to dominate only highlighted her control. By the end, the chamber itself seemed to shift. The silence that had begun it all was now joined by murmurs, reporters whispering hurried notes, colleagues exchanging loaded glances, cameras capturing every flicker of expression. What had started as routine political sparring had transformed into a spectacle. Truth versus pretense, steadiness versus bluster. But what neither Vance nor Crockett fully grasped in that instant was how far the impact would travel. The chamber buzzed with immediate fallout, but the real story was only beginning. Outside those walls, the silence, the clash, and the composure were already taking. The escalation had reached its boiling point. Vance was leaning hard on volume, on gestures meant to reclaim control, but every attempt only deepened the cracks in the performance. Crockett waited, poised, letting him exhaust himself in bluster. And then, when the moment was right, she struck with the kind of precision that doesn't just win an exchange, it defines it. She began softly, almost too softly for the way of the chamber. "Senator Vance," she said, her voice steady, "you've spoken at length about protecting the people, but when the chance comes to stand for them, where is your record? Where is your courage?" The words sliced through the noise. Vance shifted, his face tightening, but she didn't let the pause linger long enough for him to gather ground. She pressed on, layering her words like a careful cross-examination. "You speak of forgotten workers, yet when they ask for a living wage, you dismiss them. You speak of tradition, yet the tradition that built this country was sacrifice, not self-preservation. You speak of strength, yet strength isn't measured by volume, Senator. It's measured by truth." A hush fell over the chamber. Crockett's rhythm was deliberate, her tone unwavering. Every sentence was a blow, not shouted but delivered with calm conviction. Vance, the man who prided himself on rebuttals, suddenly found no easy exit. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, caught between deflection and silence. Crockett stepped closer to the microphone, lowering her voice as though speaking directly to every camera, every viewer watching at home. So I'll ask you plainly, Senator, who exactly are you serving when you choose silence over clarity, performance over honesty? It was the question that pierced everything, not just political rhetoric, but identity. It wasn't about numbers or legislation anymore. It was about integrity. Vance froze. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The chamber felt the weight of his hesitation. He glanced at his notes, shuffled them slightly, his hand twitching as though the answer might appear in ink. Nothing came. The silence thickened. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens moving faster with each second. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of discomfort on his face. On social media, the clip was already being clipped, posted, shared. J.D. Vance silence by Jasmine Crockett. Crockett didn't fill the silence. She let it breathe, let it choke the very air around him. Her composure became louder than any speech. She folded her hands, waited, and stared. For Vance, every second felt like a verdict. The smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a tight jaw and eyes darting downward. His armor of bravado shattered under the simplest weapon, a question he could not answer without betraying himself. Finally, he muttered something vague, a patchwork of talking points strung together without coherence. We must balance priorities, he stammered. But it was too late. The silence had already won. The hesitation had already told the story. Crockett's response was a masterstroke of restraint. She didn't mock him, didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat. She simply leaned into the microphone and said, "America deserves better than silence when truth is on trial." The chamber erupted, not in cheers, for that would have broken decorum, but in the unmistakable energy of recognition. Even those who disagreed with her politics could not deny the strength of the moment, and in that instant, the dynamic of power shifted completely. Crockett wasn't just holding her ground. She was commanding the stage. Vance wasn't just fumbling. He was exposed. The beauty of the moment lay not only in the takedown but in the restraint. Crockett understood something timeless. Silence, when wielded properly, is not emptiness. It is judgment, and the judgment was clear. As she gathered her papers and stepped back, the camera stayed fixed on Vance. His expression, once composed, now carried the weight of someone who had been cornered and had no escape. His allies avoided eye contact. His critics exchanged glances of quiet satisfaction. But the silence would not stay in that room. It was already echoing outward, bouncing into headlines, clips, and commentary. Within hours, it would dominate feeds and broadcasts. Within days, it would become a case study in the power of composure over arrogance. What Crockett had delivered wasn't just a mic drop. It was a blueprint, a reminder that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers and lets arrogance collapse under its own weight. And as the chamber slowly returned to routine, everyone knew routine was impossible. Something irreversible had just happened. A moment had been born that would not fade quietly into the record books, but would roar across the nation in silence. Because the silence wasn't the end of the story. It was a spark. And what followed would spread far beyond these walls, igniting reactions, movements, and conversations no one could have predicted. The silence did not stay contained within the chamber. By the time the session ended, the moment was already alive online. Clips of Vance's frozen face and Crockett's piercing words exploded across social media. On TikTok, the pause was looped with captions. "This is what accountability looks like." On Twitter, #Surge, #Crockett silences Vance, #Truth over noise. Late-night hosts replayed the exchange, pausing on the silence, letting audiences laugh, then cheer at Crockett's composure. Commentators called it a turning point, not because of the policies debated, but because of the raw exposure power without substance. Even celebrities weighed in, actors, musicians, athletes, all praising the poise of one woman standing against the noise. The ripple effect spread beyond screens. In coffee shops and classrooms, people discussed the moment not as political theater, but as a lesson. Arrogance collapses when confronted with dignity. Vance's silence became a cautionary tale. Crockett's calm became a rallying cry. The silence was no longer awkward. It had transformed into something larger, a symbol of accountability. The story passed from hand to hand, phone to phone, and as the wave spread, one question remained. What deeper meaning would America draw from it? Crockett's silence wasn't just a victory in debate. It was a moral revelation. It proved that strength doesn't always come from shouting louder or speaking longer. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from allowing arrogance to collapse under its own weight. For millions watching, her calm composure became a lesson. Truth doesn't need volume to be heard. It needs conviction. And dignity, once displayed, resonates far beyond the walls of politics. The silence spoke not only for her, but for every person who has been dismissed, every community told to wait its turn, every worker told their voice didn't matter. In that moment, Crockett turned silence into power and gave it back to the people. But the story wasn't over. Because even after the chamber cleared, the question lingered. What will we, the audience, do with the silence we've witnessed? And so we circle back to that defining instant. Jasmine Crockett, steady as stone, facing J.D. Vance, who suddenly found himself without words. The chamber had witnessed not just an exchange, but a collapse. A man known for sharp retorts and political bravado was left suspended in silence. That silence, awkward in the moment, now reverberates as one of the loudest echoes of truth this political season has given us. It's important to see the deeper meaning. This wasn't just a viral clip or a debate highlight. It was a portrait of what happens when arrogance collides with authenticity. Vance represented the performance politics we've all grown weary of. The sound bites, the chest thumping, the certainty without substance. Crockett, on the other hand, represented something profoundly different. She didn't need volume to be powerful. She didn't need theatrics to command attention. Her weapon was composure. Her shield was truth, and her silence became her final strike. That's why the moment matters. It's a reminder that dignity doesn't crumble under pressure. It stands taller. It's proof that arrogance, no matter how polished, eventually exposes its own fragility. For those who have felt ignored or underestimated, watching Crockett hold her ground was more than political theater. It was validation. It was inspiration. Across the country, the story spread. Social media clips turned into rallying cries. Commentators debated it. Communities shared it. Young people replayed it as a lesson in courage. The silence was no longer just silence. It became a mirror held up to power, showing that truth can prevail even when spoken softly or not spoken at all. And this is where you, the audience, step in. Because moments like this are not simply to be watched. They're meant to be carried forward. They're meant to fuel conversation, to inspire action, to remind us that the character of our leaders matters. Here at Argument Arena, we exist to amplify these moments, not just the noise of politics, but the truth that cuts through it. We believe in storytelling that highlights courage, dignity, and justice. If you felt something in this moment, if Crockett's silence stirred you, if Vance's collapse reminded you why authenticity matters, then let's keep this momentum alive together. Subscribe to Argument Arena. Share this story. Join a community that isn't here just to spectate, but to participate in shaping the narrative of our time. Because every voice matters, and every share helps carry truth further than arrogance can ever reach. This wasn't just about one exchange in one chamber. It was about the enduring truth that dignity holds the greatest power. And as long as moments like these continue to emerge, we'll be here, capturing them, amplifying them, and turning them into reminders that the fight for justice, respect, and equality is alive. So stay with us. Together, let's make sure silence keeps speaking louder than arrogance ever could.